Hey, what's up, guys? Anthony Testino, contributor for Eric Smith over on YouTube. And today we're going to be putting a bow on 2025 and moving toward 2026. This is a 2025 Miami Dolphins defensive review. Um, I took a look at seven guys specifically that I thought were a little bit more important, in discussing because whether or not they're going to fit, into Jeff Hafley's new scheme, new model, new philosophy, those kinds of things, I think is very important. And I think, we all had expectations for players, and we'll discuss whether or not they were met. We'll discuss how they developed and what they showed us. And like I said, some of those things can maybe give us some information in predicting maybe what 2026 might bring. So that's what we're going to do today. And yeah, like I said, so let's get into it. Let's wrap up 2025 and move on to 2026. Appreciate you guys for always checking stuff out. Happy to be back. And yep, fins up. All right, guys. So the first one that we're going to take a look at is Kenneth Grant, first round pick, 13th overall, the big man in the middle. So early on, yeah, Kenneth Grant definitely struggled, no doubt about it. But in my eyes, watching the tape, I do think that there was solid progression throughout the year, and I like how he finished the season. So we'll get into the stats a little bit here. 554 defensive snaps, 60 of them were lined up at nose tackle, 428 at defensive tackle, 54 were over the tackle, and 12 of them were outside of that. He finished with 24 tackles, 20 of them being stops, 20 hurries, 3 QB hits, 3 sacks, and 1 batted pass. But what gives me, some confidence in what we're getting from Kenneth Grant, and the fact that I do think 26 will be a much better season for him, is I saw a lot less of the really bad reps as the season went on, and he got more comfortable and kind of understood what was happening and how teams, were playing him. And he honed in more on his, leverage and technique. And, it is a big difference when you can just kind of manhandle anybody in college, and then you kind of get the rude awakening that the NFL is not like that. Even the quote unquote bad players are still pretty good. They're in the NFL for a reason. So, again, I think as the season went on, he improved a lot. In his last 5 games, he finished with 10 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 quarterback hit, 11 hurries, and 10 stops. So if you look back, most of those stats are pretty much like half or more than half of his production on the year. So in the last 5 games, like he was definitely playing at a different level, because if you extrapolate those statistics across the entire season, they're not too bad, for a guy that plays inside. He'd be looking at like somewhere between 6 and 7 sacks, which, hey, you want to give me that? That ain't too shabby. That's kind of where Zach Sealer finished this year, and Zach had a down year, but it's not easy to get sacks from the interior defensive line. So and then just kind of looking at 2026 with Jeff Hafley's scheme is a little bit more of a 4-3 penetrator type. I think that that's going to benefit Kenneth Grant. What I do need to see from him, though, is I need to see him in better shape, and prepared to play, the snaps that he's going to get, which is, it should be the second most on the team, if not the most. And if he lives up to his first round draft pipe, there's I'm gonna have no issue with that, and that's exactly what should happen. But again, there were times that early on, and even throughout the year, where I could tell I felt like he was out of shape. And I kind of get it, in a way. I don't want to make excuses for anybody, but he's a big dude, and these rookies, man, they don't. It's not easy for them to go from the college season then start training for the combine, and then immediately jump into rookie mini camp, and then the rest of camp, and then before you know it, you're in the season, and then the season is 5-6 games longer than their college season, which they're not used to, right? So there's a lot of adjusting to do, which is usually why these rookies usually kind of reset in the off season, and then you usually get that 2-year jump, and I'm really hoping and thinking that Kenneth Grant could do so, and we could be in store for a nice and improved 2026. All right, so the next one we're going to take a look at is his buddy, and that's Jordan Phillips, 5th-round pick out of Maryland. And JP finished third on the team in snaps. He had 465, so about 90 less than Kenneth Grant. He played 121 of them at nose tackle, 337 at D tackle, and he played 7 outside and over the tackle. He finished the year with 25 tackles, 18 stops, 6 hurries, and 1 QB hit. So for me, I think, I don't want it to sound like this is a negative, but I do think that Jordan Phillips probably showed the least amount of improvement from point A to point B. But I think that's because he just is who he is right now. And that's a pretty solid football player once, again, the rookie newness and, the jitters and all that kind of stuff wore off. He settled in, and he kind of just did what he does all year, which is a guy that's going to be pretty stout in the run, in the run game. He 2-gaps pretty well. He has tremendous strength and does a good job anchoring. So again, I look at Jordan Phillips, and I think that there is room for a guy like that on every roster. I'm not sure exactly how he's going to fit into this, new 2026 Jeff Hafley defense, because he's not exactly the penetrator type. But there are some instances and flashes of it, so I'm hoping to be surprised and wrong. But I definitely think, regardless of what you are as a defense, this is a guy that'll find a way to be on the field, because he does do the dirty work and he's a high motor guy. So I think he's a great dude to have and use in short yardage situations, in goal line, against heavier run teams. And if he can develop, and get past the ceiling that I think, people like myself and others have kind of, put on him, then, he could end up being a really good football player. But, again, like, the problem with a lot of these guys was there just wasn't enough flash plays. There wasn't enough disruption from these guys, and I don't want to, again, I don't want to take away from what they did do well, but I also don't want to overvalue, run stops and their stats, because again, they weren't very good for an entire season. But again, it was about the improvement and the journey and watching the defense get better as a whole. And when they started to do a better job up front, the entire defense started to do a better job as a whole. So again, I'm looking forward to 2026, and I'm really hoping that we continue to, see improvement, but at least at the minimum, we get more of what we got in 2025, at least in the second half, where he was a stout run defender, and it was pretty solid in that role. And again, I don't know if you guys caught it, but I did think one thing was interesting was Jeff Hafley said that he liked Jordan Phillips, in the draft process. So I'll be paying attention to that. Okay, so now we're going to go to the third defensive lineman that was drafted by the Dolphins in 2025, and that is Zeke Biggers. So Zeke had an interesting year, and, it's even more interesting because he's a 7th-round draft pick, where, obviously expectations are pretty low for those guys typically. Zeke started to get snaps around week 11 in this Washington game, and he finished the year with 214 snaps. He took 9 of them at nose tackle, 129 at defensive tackle, 33 over the tackle, and 43 outside of that. He finished with 8 tackles, 7 of them being stops, 5 hurries, 1 quarterback hit, and 2 sacks. And he was a little more disruptive than I think anybody really thought he would be. He's got the size and the body that's, you would probably look at him as like a 3-4 defensive end. Um, he, coming out his draft profile, it pretty much says that he doesn't really, he's not very athletic. He doesn't really rush the passer very well. He doesn't do a lot of the things that we saw flashes of, and who knows, maybe they are just flashes and that's all we'll really ever get and there'll be no consistency to him. But again, for being a 7th-round pick, I was pleased with what Zeke gave us, at least for the small portion of the season that he was available, and playing on Sundays. He also had a blocked kick, which, at his height, that's one of the few things that I'll always look for with guys that are listed at like 6'6", 6'7", 6'8", is, oh, that's a guy that can block kicks, and Zeke did that. So, again, for what it's worth, and being a 7th-round pick, I thought Zeke had a very admirable year. We'll see if he's a fit for this, new Jeff Hafley team and defense going forward. But overall, again, I think you got to be happy with anything you get from Zeke Biggers. All right, so the next one that we're going to take a look at is actually in the secondary here, and that's going to be Dante Trader, another 5th-round pick, and he was out of Maryland as well. So Trader finished the year with 420 snaps. 254 of them were in coverage, 155 were run plays, and he also rushed the passer 11 times. For alignments, he had 201 were at safety, 129 of them were in the box, and 84 of them were in the slot. He finished the season with 35 tackles, 9 missed tackles, 8 stops. He was credited with 16 catches on 18 targets for 197 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 PBU, and 3 hurries. And for me, I guess the simplest way to put it, is he reminds me a lot of Brandon Jones, who's turned out to be a pretty nice player for Denver. I would love to, say that I think Trader can get to that level, and there's a possibility that he can. He's not great at anything, but he does everything, like, at least at an average to okay level. Like, and that's the reason why you saw, the difference in where his snaps were. He was kind of used all over, and that's actually a good fit for Jeff Hafley's defense. It's just going to be whether or not Jeff Hafley believes that he can do that at a high enough level that, that he sees Trader as, a long-term, solution at one of the safety, at one of the safety spots, whether it be one of the starting guys or it's the third guy that comes in for, their big nickel. Me personally, I don't love Dante Trader when he's up top. I just don't think he's rangy enough for my liking. And I'm not quite sure about the ball skills. I think that they are probably average as well. And for me personally, like I said, I like, a guy that is just a natural, ball hawk. And if the ball is near him, they know exactly how to track it and they know how to high point the football. And, whether it's the left sideline, right sideline, they read eyes, anticipate, and they're there. That every time the quarterback throws one deep, they do have to worry about that guy, and I'm just not sure that Trader is that. But what I do think he can do, I do think he can play in the box. I like him in short bursts, and I like him anticipating short area things. I like his closing speed. Obviously, there were some missed tackles, and one specifically we just saw in a big moment, against Ladd McConkey. But again, those are things that can be improved on, right? So I'm hoping that we get that from Dante Trader. Again, I think as far as tackling goes, he had 9 missed tackles, but there was a couple that were even surprising. He was pretty solid around the goal line a couple times where he kept guys out of the end zone. He comes up and he lays some wood on Derrick Henry a couple times and does a good job of tackling in the hole. So when you look at, situations like that, I do think he can thrive in that area. And then, if you want to, if you put him there and he's got to play in hook zones and he's got to play in the flats and those kinds of things, I do think, I do think that he can. But, from all indications is Jeff Hafley is more of a cover one kind of guy where it's more man coverage and, um, more single high. So, if that's the case, I'm not sure that Trader is exactly a fit unless he's the guy and the other safety that's playing, the robber role, but that's a very specific role where, again, I just don't think you want him coming up and having to play man coverage against shiftier, quicker athletes. You don't want him getting, switched on to, a Jamar Chase or somebody in the slot or something like that, because I just think that's a really bad mismatch. And not that Jamar Chase isn't a mismatch for just about anybody, but, I just don't think you really want Dante Trader in those situations. So again, there's definitely a level of intrigue with him because, I think if he can develop and get smarter and start putting himself in better positions where he can eliminate some of the need to be fast or, he can hide a little bit of his athletic, deficiencies when it comes to matching up on more dynamic athletes. I think he can thrive in a situation like that. But, when it comes down to the draft and Jeff Hafley building this defense, I will definitely not be looking at Dante Trader as a reason why I didn't draft, an AJ Halsey in the second or a Caleb Downs or somebody like that, So, again, he filled in admirably for a team that was really bit by the injury bug in the secondary. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do, in 2026. But I'm not quite sure that there's a defined role for him quite yet. All right, so now we're going to move to Jason Marshall. And for me, I didn't know too much about Jason Marshall actually in the pre-draft process, and I was a little disappointed in myself for not finding him. But I will say he is one of the guys that I am most excited for in 2026. And that's because, again, I think his second half of the year, just like a lot of the other rookies, and young guys, I do think that they really stepped up and played at a different level when they were, when they had gotten comfortable at that point. So Jason Marshall appeared in 12 games, yeah, but there was 4 of them that he really didn't play a whole lot of snaps in. He played a significant amount in about 7 or 8 of them. As far as his snaps go, he played 38 at outside corner, played 179 in the slot, and he played 25 elsewhere, which is either at safety, in the box, or even lined up like outside, like on the line of scrimmage. He finished the season with 16 tackles, 6 missed tackles, 20 catches on 28 targets for a listed 262 yards. He allowed 2 touchdowns, had 1 interception, 3 pass breakups, and was called for 2 penalties. And again, another guy, that I thought early on, struggled a little bit. And, I know we were all disappointed in the Dolphins early on, but, it became a little bit scary that none of the rookies were really making any plays or standing out, because we knew some of these guys were going to have to play by default. So it was kind of like, you couldn't look at it from a perspective of, well, they're earning snaps. It's like, yes, they kind of are, but at the same time, they're in such a need to play because of bodies and injuries that, it's like, are they really earning snaps? So, but again, with Jason Marshall's story, this is a dude that was playing, boundary and learning the outside corner role. And with the injuries and, the musical chairs that the secondary was, especially, again, early in the season in training camp, after Cater got hurt, and then you have, Jack Jones and Rasul Douglas signings and Mike Hilton, but then you let go of Mike Hilton and you're rotating in guys like Cornell Armstrong and Kendall Sheffield. And it was one thing after another. And then Storm Duck gets hurt week 1, and now Rasul Douglas assumes the role of a starter. And then and then all of a sudden, eventually Minka had to come up and play, slot corner when Marshall was out. So, it was a tough year to navigate all of those injuries. But with Marshall, he got put into a situation where they needed him at nickel, and they let him play one preseason game at nickel, and he was the starter after that. He showed some decent physicality because he's a little bit of a bigger body guy. It's 6 foot, just about 200 pounds. Um, but at the same time, like that being a bigger body, that prototype size doesn't necessarily fit well when you're going against slot receivers with, elite level quickness and quick twitch and burst and, and all of that and that, you usually get when you line up inside. I think, again, admirable job considering he's really never done it before, but not where I want to see him. I want to see him lined up outside. And I think that, there were definitely some plays and flashes that he showed when he was lined up on the boundary. And, he's another one where you could see the confidence was, he gained confidence as the season went along. And, they asked him to do multiple things. Like he was the guy that when they ran, any kind of like inverted cover two or any kind of like buzz situation where, he's got to be a guy that drops back or rotates over and plays a safety spot. I thought I thought he did that pretty well too, especially later in the season. They ran that kind of defense actually a lot against Tampa Bay, and he had a phenomenal pass breakup against Mike Evans in a rep where he was backpedaling, flipped his hips, transitioned, stuck his foot in the ground, drove on a ball down the middle seam and knocked it away. I mean, it was a fantastic rep. And then, in the Washington game, I thought, they kind of targeted him at the end, trying to pick on the rookie to get in the field goal range, to beat Miami. And he stepped up, to the plate, and he got the job done with a pass breakup on Robbie Chosen. And also, too, even on the play where Jack Jones gets the interception, he had such great coverage that Marcus Mariota was looking to put the ball outside. That was the first read, but he had to come off of that. And when he did, that's when he threw the ball to the crosser, and Jack Jones undercut it for the interception that ultimately ended up being the reason that Miami won the game. So again, there were some really good reps when he was outside playing boundary. And, when Jeff Hafley's talked about his defense and, some of the things that you've heard and come across, while trying to collect information and learn about him and what kind of scheme and philosophy he's going to be bringing to the Miami Dolphins. I'm excited about Jason Marshall being a fit and really getting a solid look and hopefully some really good coaching when it comes to, the boundary corner, because, if they can, they own the rights to Jason Marshall for the next 3 seasons, being, that he was, a later pick, and they have him for 4 years. That's obviously, again, a situation where, if you can do that without having to spend money and, the more rookies and young guys you can get to play, at starter level of football, the better your team's going to be for the now and the future. So, I'm really excited about Jason Marshall. I love the thought of pairing him with JuJu Brents. I think that can be exciting. But overall, yeah, I was very pleased. It's not necessarily a guy that I really want to see inside. I think he can play man. I think he can play zone. I think Jason Marshall can honestly do it all. And again, I'm really excited to see him, with Jeff Hafley, and I really hope that Hafley, views him the same way and, gives him a legitimate chance as a boundary corner and even, as a possible starter. Miami's in a position right now where, again, Rasul Douglas is expiring contract. Jack Jones is an expiring contract. They don't really have too much there. I mean, JuJu Brents is there for another year, but he's also recovering from an injury. It's still the same group with Ethan Bonner, Isaiah Johnson, and, players like that. So it's not like Miami really has anything that's totally set in stone. They do and are open to, 2 starters on the boundary. So in a cover 1 scheme, it's going to be very important that they find these corners. And I do think that Jason Marshall's got a chance at being one of them. All right, so the next guy we're going to take a look at is somebody that I know everyone is very interested in, disappointed in, and he's a little bit of a hot topic. It's Chop Robinson. So Chop, in the beginning of the season, wasn't really getting the snaps that I thought he should be getting if you wanted to see this guy develop, quite honestly. He was third in line behind Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips, and I can understand that. But I also think then at that point you need to temper your expectations to what Chop Robinson's going to give you. Anthony Weaver admitted himself that Chop is the kind of guy that gets better with more snaps. Well, then if you're only going to give him 20-something a game, I don't know how you can expect the world from him or him to look like a first-round pick, when he's not being allowed to develop and, get better on the field. Like, you kind of have to go through those bumps and bruises, and he's got to play and get reps in order to get better. And we saw that last year when he, started to get more reps as the season went on, and, he got better at playing the run. He got more disruptive. He got after the quarterback more. So again, it was no surprise to me that in limited snaps, you really didn't get what you wanted from Chop Robinson. He finished the year with 417 snaps, 241 pass rush, 150 in run defense, and 26 in coverage, 14 hurries, 1 QB hit, finished with 4 sacks, 15 tackles, 1 forced fumble, and there's a 5-game stretch because I didn't include the Tampa Bay game because he got hurt in that game and only played about 18 snaps. But in a 5-game stretch, week 11, week 13, 14, 15, and 16, he played 47% of the snaps, of his total snaps on the year in those 5 games. And he had the 3 sacks, 6 hurries, 1 QB hit, 8 tackles, 1 forced fumble, and he had some, I would call it a safety. Not officially because the referee let Marcus Mariota get away with it, but that should have been a safety and another sack. And I think if you extrapolate that over the course of a season, that's not so bad looking. It's not quite the, down year that everyone thinks it is. And listen, he does have a lot to improve on, especially in the run game and playing technically sound. But when it comes to getting after the passer, I do believe that he can. He just needs to get. I think. Don't get me wrong. I think that there's things that he can do to improve and help himself. But I also do think that he needs more reps, and hopefully this year he'll get them in Jeff Hafley's defense, which is more of a 4-3, and he'll be hand in the dirt, rushing and playing aggressive. All right, and the last one that we're going to take a look at is also in the secondary, and this is JuJu Brents, which is very, very intriguing of a player. So let's paint the picture that, he was a second-round pick from Indy. Miami claimed him, got him just before the season started. Took him a little bit to get acclimated, understand the defense, and then actually get on the field. And his first game was when, he started to play against the Chargers. He's a big 6'3", 200-pound corner. He's primarily a zone coverage guy, more so than he is a man-to-man guy, even though I do think that, he could probably do both, at least, the man coverage stuff at a acceptable level. Again, in Hafley's cover 1 man press scheme, I do think there's a possibility for him to slide back to safety, actually, which was something that, people had talked about during his draft year and the breakdowns and, his profile. They had talked about, safety being a possibility for a player like him because of his size and his zone coverage ability and ability to anticipate and things of that nature. So I'm very curious to see if maybe that's the route they go. If they don't love his man-to-man skills, and they agree that he's more of a zone-based corner, but they like the skill set, they like the size, they like the speed, all that kind of stuff. And if that's the case, we could see a position change where maybe JuJu Brents ends up getting in the rotation with the safeties. And in this defense under Hafley, the safeties and the corners, they're all very, very important. But Jeff Hafley ended up running, his primary nickel in 2025 was not with 3 corners, it was with 3 safeties. So, the bottom line is that, he'll play and the safeties do a lot of moving and rotating and changing, pre-snap and post-snap looks and coverage. And they, all of them, will rotate down into the box and play some man coverage. And, so they have to be very versatile. And I do think, again, JuJu, I think his skill set and his size and all that allow you to do quite a bit with him. Really fun player. So he's another one. He finished with 110 snaps. 66 were in coverage, 44 in run defense. He had 10 tackles, 2 missed tackles. He allowed 4 catches on 7 targets for 29 yards, and he had 1 official pass breakup. So, I think his best game was the game in Buffalo where he just locked up the outside. He was tested deep multiple times, stood up to the task. And, I think a lot of us were very happy with what we saw in limited time from JuJu. And, I really hope that his recovery is going well. The plan is for him to be ready and 100% healthy going into 2026. So that's, my fingers are crossed for that as well. I think if we get that, regardless if he's at safety or corner, I think it's a very skilled player that Jeff Hafley should be looking at and thinking that I got to find a way to get this dude on the field, and because I think he can be an asset. Again, I think, when you look at it and Miami's in a position where they're uncertain about which way and which direction they're going to go as a team, because their salary cap situation makes it very difficult to maneuver everything. But specifically in the secondary, you do have Minkah coming back for 1 year, but there's been plenty of talk of whether or not he's a trade candidate or if he's potentially a cut and cap casualty, because you can save some money there. He's also potentially a restructure candidate, or an extension guy, because Minkah, I thought, played pretty damn well, and again, when you're starting a new era of football, you do need leaders and you do need guys that are going to receive the message and then share that with the team and get the team to buy in. And a guy like Minkah, who has the respect of his peers and played pretty damn good football, I thought, last year. I do, and then not to mention, his fit in the defense is fantastic for what Jeff wants to do. I do think that Minkah could be a guy that returns as well, and hopefully he'll be here for a couple years. But with that said, like, Miami could have part of their secondary in place already if we get lucky enough and these guys really step up to the plate. Between Minkah, Dante Trader, who I mentioned before and I talked about, I'm not quite sure of his fit, but I do like the player to a point if he's in the right role. Jason Marshall, and hopefully a 100% healthy JuJu Brents. I think if you can get those guys on board in your scheme and find the right fit, I do think that there's some good that can come out of that. So definitely something to pay attention to going forward and looking into 2026.